There is one field of craft and creation that has always fascinated me, and that is the art of gunsmithing. A very specific art though, not talking about the modern stuff. I'm talking about smithing of dueling pistols from the 1700s up until the mid-1800s. These weapons were some of the most finely crafted instruments of their day. Before even going down this rabbit hole of industrial design, the first real area of creativity that fascinated me the most was when I looked at these incredible period pieces that were made by master gunsmiths in London and in Europe. The pure thought and the approach taken to making these instruments blew me away. The finishing, the materials used, just how they were designed and positioned, the different handles, all of these details. And once a year I find myself always jumping back and reflecting on dueling pistols. Don't know why, it's always been a thing in the back of my mind. So just recently I was reflecting back on this and thought to myself, what could we affiliate to this craft of dueling pistols, this craft of watchmaking in and around this time period? And one name really jumped to mind, and that is Breguet. Breguet was established in 1775, very much around the same time when you saw these incredible pistols and works of art made. And the thinking was, let's discuss the brand of Breguet in a little bit of a broader term, trying to create some kind of analogy between the art of the dueling pistol, how it was made, as well as comparing it to just how the Breguet Classique line and this family has established itself over the years. So Breguet as a family name doesn't need much credit from my side. I'm by no means someone qualified to talk about watchmaking, but I do know the basics. They produced one of the first self-winding movements. They created the first minute repeaters, invented the Breguet hands, Breguet numerals, overcoils, all sorts of details. The tourbillon is widely debated as being a movement that Breguet created, but that's since been debunked thanks to Adrian from Bark and Jack talking about an English watchmaker who actually created the tourbillon. There was talk about Breguet creating the world's first wristwatch, another debated subject. Perpetual calendars, all sorts of little details, and most recently a magnetic pivot which allows the movement to work without friction with certain models. But regarding the true nature of the brand, I think the Breguet Classique really sums up just what Breguet is trying to represent as a brand. As we know, they are very particular in the way they approach their designs in this family because they are trying their hardest to condense the pocket watch form into a wristwatch. You look at these pieces like the standard 5157 and it looks like it is a condensed pocket watch through and through. And this design, this whole approach and this language speaks so much to the time period when they were first made and conceived, very much like the dueling pistols and this finely crafted instrumentation that was made in and around that time. Within the family we see all sorts of different changes, just within the Classique line as we will stay. We have power reserve indicators, we have sub-seconds dials, asymmetric forms, very intelligently thought out. And this language that they have adopted is period correct, in a very similar time when English watchmaking was at its height. But if we are to move our attention to the most basic of the Classique family, it's the level of restraint that the watches sort of possess. You can tell immediately that it is a Breguet just by the design of the case, the straight lugs, the way the case has these fluted cuts all around it, which very much emphasizes what the pocket watch design was like back in the day. One aspect that really appeals to me is just the way that the gold on the dial has been handled, and the fact that you have this sector dial form factor that runs around it. There's something about dress watches and sector dials that always appeals to me. The high contrast between the brush polished surfaces against the guilloche on the dial, it really does speak volumes about the approach and just the overall balance between the name and the serial number at the base. Very clean, very symmetrical, easy to understand. And when we see how this watch places itself, how it positions itself with the use of straight lugs, its very pocket watch styled case, dial design, Breguet hands, it is all oriented around the name Breguet, which is quite fascinating because you find most brands nowadays sort of take ideas from others. There's nothing very original. But you know that when you're dealing with Breguet, this design is wholly original and it always has been used by this family. We move through the lines and we see examples like the 5177, which has a blue enamel dial, now using Breguet numerals instead of Roman numerals. Now this would be a much more period correct and sort of characteristic model of the Breguet family, since it incorporates more elements that links to its name. But for some reason the approach doesn't speak to me nearly as much as the amount of texture that is offered on other well-known dials, like the 5277 that has a large power reserve indicator, a central sub-seconds. Just within the standard Classique line, you then have examples that have a date complication at the 6 o'clock position, a full running seconds around the dial. We get to other more complicated examples like the 7727, which has everything from a 10 Hz movement to this magnetic balance system that the movement has incorporated, allowing for a lot less friction to happen on the movement, keeping the movement more balanced and secure, and allowing the watch not to deviate in time when it's being used on a daily basis. It's a very distinct watch in many ways. I think the root element that really appeals to me about the name is that it feels very much like a product crafted all those hundreds of years ago. It very much is a time capsule to that point. And of course there are so many other examples of approaches like the Lange line, like Patek Philippe, but I think Breguet really does attack it differently, and for that reason manages to address the whole concept of the dress watch very differently. Now, of course, a line like this, Breguet watches, dress watches in general, don't appeal to the masses. The question is whether or not more people will find dress watches appealing one day. I think as we go through our lives, we start developing our own tastes, our own appreciation for various things. And where someone like me, who isn't that much of a fanatic for dress watches, I can see these pieces and think to myself, I would wear that, simply for the reason that it's a piece that speaks to a very different time. It's not addressing minimalism, it's not trying to show a Saxonian approach or a Swiss method of watch design. It very much looks at the French traditional methods or the English traditional methods of pocket watch making, scaling them down to make them wearable on the wrist, and has kept that approach for hundreds of years. Again, very much like the FP Jaune video that I did recently and the Alanga & Zone video, you can't talk about these watches without discussing their movements. And once again, that's an area where I lack knowledge. What can be said is that the approaches taken here is mind-blowing. The way the rotor has been arranged, the way the balance bridge has been adjusted, the idea of incorporating a power reserve indicator at the back of the movement. More watches should incorporate this. There is so much subtlety behind the brand, and I think that's what really appeals to any kind of enthusiast. Nowadays, people talk a lot about owning Patek Philippe. It's as popular as Rolex. It seems like the appeal of Alanga & Zona has started to reach the masses. But then when you take your head out of that realm and sort of tone it back and think to where watchmaking sort of began, where it originated, you start saying, wouldn't it be nice to have a watch that represents the traditions, the practices, the approaches made hundreds of years ago? And for that reason, that's why Breguet as a name speaks to me. And the Classique line very much epitomizes that appeal. Circling back to Duelling Pistols and giving them a bit more of a limelight, what's interesting is that the English approach, as opposed to the European, primarily French approach, is that English pistols were very unadorned, sort of like the Saxonian approach to watchmaking, where the French pistols were very elaborate. And in a similar way to brands like Breguet, they seem to ride the line. You seem to have a fine balance between the more elaborate approach and the very toned down approach. The whole idea for the English approach of gun making was to create a piece that was simple to use, operate, very magnificent, but the functioning had to be perfect. French, on the other hand, wanted to find that balance between something that was highly ornate, left on display, but could also do the job perfectly. And that's why I think this parable between Breguet wristwatches and Duelling Pistols works so well. There are elements to these finely crafted pieces that say a lot about their past, that say a lot about who made them, the efforts that went into creating these things. And even when you're wearing the simplest model on your wrist, you can sort of start thinking back to who wore these in the past. The Duke of Wellington, Napoleon Bonaparte, Winston Churchill. The improvements that these watches made over the years, automatic movements, minute repeaters, Breguet hands, Breguet numerals, shock resistance. It's a family of watches that not only paved the way forward for modern watchmaking, but even to this day really glorifies that approach taken. And for that reason, I think Breguet as a family should be considered a lot more by us enthusiasts.